They're so large, you can't fathom it. People disappear. I'm not saying that they do, but when you see how large they are, it makes you wonder.
And I saw clearly about a 6 foot to 6'3" creature, and it roars at me again. And when it roars, it's kind of a howling roar.
So I grew up in this hunting family, and we all dug ginseng, we all trapped, we all hunted. We had rabbit dogs, coon dogs, everything we did, and hunted everything in season. And on New Year's Day, it was a very cold day. New Year's Eve, we got 4 inches of snow. I was a teenager, and I had went with this other gentleman that was in the Army, going to be in the Army later, and had my rabbit dogs, and we were running them. And I came along this hillside, and it was a beautiful sunny day, but cold, teens, 20s. And there was a cave up on this hillside, but you really couldn't tell that unless you knew it. But when I came along the hillside, I found very, very fresh human footprints. I didn't know what Bigfoot was, never heard of Bigfoot. To me, in the 70s, I thought it was a drug person, and a druggie was living in that cave. And it was apparent that they had left because me and my dogs were coming, they had heard us coming. And I walked up there to check and to see whether or not, there was like a fire in there, or there's some clothes, but there was nothing there. And they weren't exorbitantly large, they were just a normal human-sized footprint. And him and I talked about following him, and I remember, us hearing this loud yell, and we just kind of looked at each other. We had no idea what it was. And then later that year, there was a beaver dam that my family fished at. No one knew about this dam. It was just this little creek, but if you followed it back an arrow off trail for about a mile, the beavers had dammed it up, and it was unbelievable fishing. And I had fished back there. I set turtle hooks back there. I had hunted back there. I never had anything happen to me. But this one time, I was with my uncle. We were both wearing pistols because it was very snaky back there. And I could hear something coming through the brush. I was standing on the dam, and the brush was about 40 yards away from me on the other side of the water at this point. Some places it was real wide, but where I was, it was just about that wide. And I glanced over and saw my uncle, which was, maybe 20 or 30 feet from me, and I saw he was looking too, and I just assumed it was probably going to be, a deer coming down, but it started shaking the brush, making very loud kind of monkey sounds, kind of a hoo, 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 hoo. And, I said, what is that, Uncle Lee? And he's like, I don't know. He's like, just look for a tree you can get to. So, I'm looking for a tree that I had to get up something, because it'd have to come across the water to get to me. But it was so thick right there that I just couldn't see. And it went on for maybe, less than a minute, and then it quit. And we just kept fishing. Because, we were raised that there was nothing in the woods that wasn't more afraid of us than it. Had no idea what it was. Didn't even think much about it. And like I said, you see it and you think, well, can something like that really exist? Can something be out there that has gotten by without being discovered or acknowledged by man?
Well, I grew up in McDowell County. I'd moved away, went to college, had a job. After about 20 years, I moved back, And there's a lot of land companies own a lot of property down there. A total of actually 50 acres we own, 30 plus 20. And I was able to lease 1,000 acres of land from a land company. Even compared to here in Kanawha County, you go to McDowell County, it's more rugged, it's more, the terrain's steeper. It's, in some places, it's literally impenetrable. You can't hardly get from point A to point B. If you have 400 acres of property, you may only be able to hunt 70 acres. Well, you know, growing up, you hear things. But as an adult, when something happens to you, a lot of those things come flooding back that you'd completely written off. When I was a child, there was a bus driver for the McDowell County Schools. Actually, her bus route was in Panther State Forest, which is right across from our property line. Every morning she would stop, park her bus, wait on the kids to walk out. That particular morning, the bus was not there. What had happened was, she claimed that as she was waiting, backed into this, it's called George's Fork Hollow, as she was waiting on the kids to come down to get on the bus, she heard something in the woods coming toward her. She got out of the bus just to look, it was right after daylight, and she described something like a big, well, hairy covered monster. It ran off the side of the hill and jumped onto the roof of the bus. She panicked, she took off driving with the thing she thought still on the roof. She went up to the bus garage, which was in a little town of Yeager, and quit. She quit her job. Now, how I know this, I was one of those kids walking to that bus. I had completely forgotten about it until later in life when something happened to me and my mother reminded me of it.
They say it's almost heaven. It's not hard to build a case for that. From the rapids of the New River Gorge to the wilderness of dolly sods, West Virginia offers natural beauty on a grand scale. Some have referred to the mountain state as the Pacific Northwest of the East. And it's true, there's plenty of elevation, vegetation, and precipitation in both places. It's a convenient comparison, but the fact is, West Virginia is uniquely breathtaking, rugged, and complicated. For every sun-drenched summit, there's also a dark holler. And if what people say is true, those hollers hide some deep secrets, secrets that make heaven seem distant. Maybe that helps explain why Native American history is hard to pin down in this region, while the Adena built many earthworks that remain near Moundsville and Charleston. Their culture was decimated by the Iroquois Confederacy around 1650. When Europeans arrived in the 1700s, they learned the indigenous people fought and hunted on this land, but relatively few lived on it. What was it that kept them away? As the British and French pushed west with conflicting claims on this wild territory, the door was opened for waves of immigrants to try their hand at a new life. Scots-Irish, Swiss, Italians, Poles, Serbs, and Germans came to work in the coal mines, bringing their languages, beliefs, and superstitions with them. With their own assumptions and vocabularies, they would try to describe the weird world surrounding them, a world that was apparently populated by red-eyed nighttime visitors, ghostly, shrieking apparitions, even animals that defied classification. Originally shared by word of mouth, the rise of newspaper, radio, and television would speed the spread of these accounts. By the mid-20th century, the once isolated communities of Flatwoods in Braxton County and Point Pleasant on the banks of the Ohio River would be thrust onto the world stage because of the inexplicable events unfolding in those towns. But these were simply modern manifestations of a much older truth. The shadowy caverns, caves, and mines, the ancient mountain ranges and dense forests of West Virginia conceal the unimaginable.
What I hear from people that aren't from here when they fly in and it's dark, and when they get up in the morning, if they're looking at a hotel or whatever, is everyone talks about how green it is because of the size of the state, the steep, rugged terrain that you just can't fathom until you're actually on one of these hillsides trying to get up it or looking at it and just being blown away by the fact of how much space there is in between the roads. Some places as much as 21 miles in between two roads.
Can you talk about that a little bit? And I'm curious what your take is on this idea that natives avoided.
Oh, you mean the Shawnee?
Sure.
The Shawnee.
When you hear it on television, they literally say that
The natives.
Native
Yeah.
Americans did not come in.
It was more the Shawnee, particularly because the belief was that their ancestors had rid the land of these rather large beings, and they believed that the whole valley was pretty much cursed and haunted by the ghosts of these things. I was taught by some Shawnee, so I've heard some of the legends and whatnot, but legends are legends, right? I mean, until you find something that kind of backs that up. Now, I haven't seen any giant ghosts, but it doesn't mean they're not there. We've also had the theory that, these giant ghosts could have simply been Bigfoot sightings seen through fog by, ancient people as they came through the valley.
If no other state on the East Coast would be habitable to something like a Sasquatch, West Virginia would be the place. The habitat is so large for something like that to exist, and the population is so low. West Virginia's state population is still declining. We have people moving every year and leaving the state, and that just opens up more and more real estate for something like a Bigfoot that would want to live out here, because a lot of these people that are leaving do live out in these hills and hollers. And when somebody leaves one of the hollers, not many people will try to go back into them anymore.
The state is it is the territory. And other than here and probably the Pacific Northwest, you're not gonna find a better habitat for a physical creature. If we are talking about a physical creature, it can hide out there. It can hide right here in these woods, and you would never see that thing unless it wanted to be seen.
The terrain, like, we had talked about the terrain. It's hilly, it's mountainous. I mean, you can just look right outside our window, and we live down in a bowl and a holler, as you would say. For us slightly older people, it's a lot tougher to, traverse all these mountains and things like that. But the people are very reluctant to talk about their sightings.
To outsiders, like if you're not from around here, if you didn't grow up here, they're less likely to open up to you and talk to you about things.
One of the very first reports I took was a state policeman out of Raleigh County, which is Beckley, West Virginia on the turnpike. And I called him and we're talking, and he said that, he was riding his four-wheeler on this right-of-way, and him and his wife like to look for ginseng, but this was summer, so you can only harvest ginseng in the fall. And they were just looking around, and they kind of zoomed off the side of this right-of-way, and they were on this little path, and he's putting along. He said he looked up, he saw a fire-burned stump, he's looking back down, and he looks back up, and he pauses, and he said, "Have you ever seen one?" And I said, "No." And he said, "They're so large, you can't fathom it. They're the size of a sheet of plywood." And he's like, people disappear. I'm not saying that they do, but when you see how large they are, it makes you wonder. And he said, I started hitting reverse. I had a gun. I didn't even think about using it. It was too large. And my wife said, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Look, look, look, look." And his wife just started screaming, "Oh my God, no, oh my God, no." And they got turned around and got out of there. And that was one of the first reports, and the one that made me really think that, you know, legitimately something had happened. And I went back to that location with him. I took an investigator, a friend of mine, Darren Pavarnik, and we went there, and there was another trooper, and they're both holding their gun out. The guy that had the sighting is crying. He's chain smoking. He won't let us make any type of calls or noise or do anything else. He's too fearful. It was apparent, you know, he saw something. Whether or not, he certainly wasn't faking, you know, because in the end, most of the people that you're talking to, they either misidentified something, they legitimately saw something, or they're lying. It was apparent he wasn't lying.
So in my experience, when we go out to these areas, because we set up at these little events here in West Virginia that we host these little, you know, talks and such. We have a large community turnout that will come to these. A bunch of kids will come, and their parents and everybody show up when they first get there. Everybody's like, "Oh yeah, Bigfoot, Bigfoot," and they're kind of ribbing it and making fun of it. But before the end of the night, they're coming over to you and they're talking and they're saying, "You know, I really do think there is something out there. You know, I was out there," and they'll share their story with you. So it's this weird dichotomy where the same individual that will, in one side of the coin, make fun of it and take jabs, when the room gets quiet, they'll come over and they'll share their story with you because they've had an experience themselves as well that they can't quite explain.
Hundreds of reports later, you know, most of them that you get are, you know, you saw something crossing the road, you got a brief encounter with something, you know, throwing rocks at you or whatever it happens to be. You hear something hit a tree, you know, different things like that that could or could not be anything. But a couple times a year, just in the state of West Virginia or Ohio, you will get legitimately an awesome report that keeps you going.
I tied up the lease on the property. I've been working land. I had several areas. I had trail cameras and food plots. And I just kind of made that my hobby. I guess you'd say I'd go out 4 or 5 days a week, looking over the property. I would make sure that nobody was stealing timber from the land company. And there was active coal mines. When they were closed, they wanted to make sure nobody was stealing copper, going in there and trespassing. So I did that kind of as a part-time job. I was teaching school. And I'd come in every evening and do it. During that time, my wife had gotten sick with some kidney issues. So I started neglecting being able to go out into the woods. I was taking her to the hospital a lot. And after we got her out of the hospital, took her home, she was really weak, but I'd been nervous, I guess you would say stressed over all the issues going on at home. And kind of one of my stress relievers is just get out in the woods. So my wife said, "You need to just go out in the woods, chill for a while." So that's what I did. I went to all of the sites where I had corn feeder buckets, food plots, and everything had been tore up, which is not unusual. Bears will get into the stuff. But looking back, again, hindsight's 20/20. There was a couple feeders that literally looked like they had been torn up with by human hands. I had one 250-pound tripod feeder that had a electronic device on the bottom with a battery, so forth and so on. It had almost been like disassembled and thrown around. Now, I had a lot of money in that one. And since all of my stuff I was discovering was tore up, I decided to take some of them back home to try to work on them. The one feeder that I brought back specifically was one of the more expensive. When I got home, I was on my four-wheeler. My wife comes outside and she says, did you enjoy yourself, whatever? Of course, I said I did, but I said, something's tore all of my feeders up. And this one particular feeder head I had, it had brown hair all over it. That evening, I tried to fix the feeder head and I couldn't get it to work. But my front porch sits right adjacent to the woods. And I actually had, at that time, an eyewitness account. I had a Sasquatch come right to within 60 yards of me. To say that Okay, at the time I wasn't thinking Sasquatch. I thought monster was the only thing I could think. It was right at dark, but it was in the middle of the summer, perfectly clear. And anybody who lives in the country where you don't have artificial light and you have a clear dusk, you can see everything. But this thing roared at me. And it roared at me, and it was so loud I could feel the power reverberate through me. And I'm sitting on my porch. But how I realized it was coming toward me, I heard something up on the ridge making a lot of noise, and it was being really loud. The best way to describe it, it sounded, the way I described it later, if you take an S10 pickup truck, put it up on the top of a ridge, put it in neutral and let it roll. It just sounded like a dozer coming through the woods. I had basset hounds, and they were so scared. I kept them in a kennel. They were running and trying to get in the kennel. And since they couldn't get in, they got in I uprooted a tree because I just moved down, was working on my yard. There was a big hole in the side of the mountain, kind of like a little cubby hole. The dogs got in the cubby hole. They were so afraid. So I'm locking in and looking at this thing, trying to figure out what's going on. And I noticed movement. I had 2 trash cans sitting across the road where the trash company come through and pick up my trash. My thought was, it's a huge bear probably going to come in and get in my trash. So I'm watching, and I see something come out of the wood line, and the best way to describe it it squatted down. Now when it squats down, again, I've killed bear with my bow. I've got them hanging on my wall. Your mind's going to say, well, that's just a really big bear, and it's now sitting on its rump, looking at me, trying to get courage to go to the trash cans. That's how they'll act. So this thing is sitting there, and it's probably about that tall, probably a little taller, about 5 foot tall, and I thought it was sitting on its butt. It just looked like a 500-pound bear, probably. It's perfectly motionless. If you'd have walked by on the road, you'd have been 10 yards away, you'd have never saw it. It blended in perfectly. I got so bored with it was so motionless after a few minutes, I just went back to working on this feeder head, ignoring it. And as your peripheral vision will pick up movement, again, I'm working on a feeder head. I'm thinking this bear's gonna go get in my trash. When it does, I'll just go get a gun, shoot up in the air, run it off. I saw movement, so I look, this thing stands up. And when it stands up, you look, that don't look like a bear. But again, that's all you know. But it turns side profile to me. It's looking at me. And it commences to walking from left to right. And at this point, I'm just in total disbelief of what I'm seeing. To a point, I'm within 5 feet of my front door of my house. I could have got a camera, I could have got an audio recording device, I had all that. I froze. I watched this thing walk, and it walks all the way, probably about 50 yards from left to right, paralleling me, and it never takes its eyes off of me. Even though it's walking through undergrowth, it never takes its eyes off of me. And it goes up into a pine thicket, and it turns, and it roars at me again. And when it roars, it's kind of a howling roar that I can't explain it. I don't know if you've ever heard a lion, if you've ever been to the zoo and heard a lion roar. It had that kind of depth to it, but it was a lot stronger. And I'm still shocked. I'm just sitting here. It roars again, 3 times. And then something across the ridge hollows back. The 3rd time this thing roared, for some reason I kind of snapped out of my stupor. You would think the natural reaction would be get a camera, get audio. I went in the house, locked all my doors, crazy reaction. Locked all my doors, locked my windows. My kids were little at the time. My wife was in the bed sick. My first thought was, I'm moving now. It was how much fear overcame me, and I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't want to upset my wife. She'd been in a coma about 2 weeks prior, so I didn't want to upset her. So I sat down at my kitchen table and I tried to reason, what's happening here? I'm trying to, gather my thoughts. It rattled me so bad, I blocked it out for a while. When I say, well, about a year. It bothered me so bad. It shook me up so bad. Just anytime I would go outside, I would just get an overwhelming fear. And my wife, I woke her up that night. She was in the bed sick, and I finally talked to her. And coincidentally, she had said, our son at the time was only 5 or 6 years old. She said he was out in the yard, and she was just too sick to go out there with him, so she sat on the porch. She said, I could hear something up in the woods, beating on trees, she said. And she said, our son, she said, I went in the house, I was tired and sat on the couch. He comes in a little while later and says, Mom, there's aliens in the woods. Now, of course, from a 5 or 6 year old kid, he don't know how to explain what he's seeing. But he told her there was aliens in the woods. So clearly there had been something had happened with them earlier, and it had happened with me. I'd gotten to a point where I was a hunter, I was a camper, I was an outdoor guy, never seen it, never heard it. Maybe I did, just didn't pay attention. And that was the first slap in the face that I ever had. And it took me over a year to come to grips with it.
America's first daily newspaper, the Pennsylvania Packet and Daily Advertiser, began publication on September 21st, 1784, and it didn't take long for fantastic stories to find their way to the printed page. Beginning with the 1790s and accelerating throughout the 1800s, reports of hairy wild men ran rampant in the press. While some stories were clearly whimsical, virtually winking at the reader, others were presented as factual, and in great detail named witnesses and locations in such a way as to invite further investigation. Wild man tales of the 1800s came from every corner of North America, as explorers became settlers on the doorstep of the New World's forests and swamps. In many cases, the accounts described what seem like feral humans, but in others, the appearance and behavior was decidedly different, forcing reporters to use words like ape, gorilla, and monster as descriptors. More often than not, the newspapers chronicled conflict between pioneers and these bestial figures, which seemed to delight in menacing homesteads and threatening livestock. Prominent members of these frontier communities banded together to defend home and property, and occasionally a creature would be captured, if the stories are to be believed. The papers made the wild man a matter of record among the reading public, but the indigenous people of Appalachia needed no such validation. For ages, they had told their own stories of the stone man Nunyonowi, whose hide in rock-like fashion could not be pierced by any weapon. The giants were feared by the Cherokee and Onondaga for their reputation as tricksters, as well as their appetite for human flesh. The February 13, 1884 edition of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch proved that West Virginia held its own mysteries. In a lengthy article, it covered the work of Professor P.W. Norris, Assistant United States Ethnologist, who exhumed a 7-foot 6-inch skeleton from a large burial mound in the Kanawha Valley. Whether or not these were the bones of the stone man is a matter of conjecture. What's far more certain is that the 1800s were a wild time in the Mountain State.
As the immigrants were moving westward, they were encountering all kinds of weird stuff. That's where they got those giant two-headed turtles from, and we get the Ogwai. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as the pioneers were moving westward, coming out of Virginia and up in the Northeast, and they were moving into West Virginia before anything was ever out here, there's stories of, large snapping turtles. One of them in particular was a two-headed snapping turtle that they call the ogwai. And it was it was big enough to take down I think it was a dog or a sheep that it took. And it was out in the Monongahela area. And it's very possible that that was the last of its species. You know, there are ancient snapping turtles that did get that size. They're on the fossil record, and it's not impossible that there was a holdover there, that it was just a lingering last of its kind of deal. And they also came across all kinds of other stuff when they came through the land here. You know, we had giant ground sloths here back during the last ice age. So they might have come across one of those, or at least came across the remains of them.
Appalachia in West Virginia, a lot of the Indians didn't live here. This was a hunting ground for 5 different tribes. 5 of the Indian tribes had names for Bigfoot, and the Iroquois name for Bigfoot was Stone Man. Now we don't know if it's because they like to travel ridges and they're, you know, always up on the stones, or whether it's because they were throwing stones. We don't have any idea, but I just preferred Stone Man as opposed to some of the other names. There's Stone Coat, Stone Giant, and I just like Stone Man the best. There's a lot of documents that when people cover, you know, the early pioneers and whatnot, when they would go through and take historical accounts. I mean, not necessarily the stories that they had.
In West Virginia, the original name was either going to be the Wild Man or the Wood Booger. That's the 2 titles that they stuck on Bigfoot that later became known as Bigfoot, were all these Wild Man or Hairy Man and Wood Booger stories. So if you're going through archivally, those are the 3 key terms you look for, is the Wild Man or the Hairy Man. And there's a lot of Wild Man stories where they come into town, and you know, they'll take some farm or agricultural products and just run off into the woods, and a band of merry men will go out chasing it, and they'll document it in the newspaper, because you know, that's all there was going on in the newspaper back then.
Are there any of the historical accounts that do stand out to you from West Virginia that you've managed to look into yet?
Wow. We just saw that there was one from like 1914. There was 2 hunters, and there was 2 Bigfoot circling them at a place called Capicon Bridge, West Virginia. And don't ask me where that is, because I don't know yet. I don't know my geography yet, or West Virginia. We're learning. We got the panhandle down. And they were out turkey hunting, and they heard noises around them. And all of a sudden, one Bigfoot comes out. One of the hunters drops his gun. Another Bigfoot came from behind another hunter. He dropped his gun, and one of them grabbed him, kind of tore his jacket a little bit. He was able to pick his gun back up and shoot it in the air, and these creatures started to run back, and then he shot it in the air twice more, and then these creatures ran away. Now that's pretty intimidating when when you're actually, someone could have been attacked by a Bigfoot.
When people gave eyewitness testimony in the past, they looked at it so differently than we do. And it's so funny, I look back and I see some of John Green's reports, and he had people go before a magistrate and swear that this is what they'd saw. Now we would just all laugh about that. Like, you know, I mean, who's gonna do that? Like we couldn't even probably find a magistrate to do it anyways, but no one would be compelled. But in the old days, they were compelled by witness testimony. People wouldn't, you know, fake things like that. They were just gonna say this is the way it was. So I do think that it's common when they didn't recognize things in the 1800s that they said, they just used things that they could attribute it to. For instance, like, you know, we all know that when Daniel Boone was passing away and they were asking about regrets of his life, and he had said that he had shot a Yahoo, a 10-foot tall Yahoo, and he regretted that or whatever. But Yahoos, you know, a very popular book at that time was Gulliver's Travels, and they had Yahoos, which was a primate ape-like creature that was very tall, and that's what he related it to. And here in the mountains and valleys of West Virginia, you'll hear people say that they're called Yahoos or Yahoos, and it's really not related to a sound that they make, because that's not really a Bigfoot sound so much. But I think it's just that historically everybody's relating to what that they had to reach back to look at. And we all kind of knew what a wild man was as soon as someone puts that or proffers it. We think, you know, here's this person running around that, you know, was crazy and wild and screaming and running and kind of a lunatic type thing. And, you know, so I think that when you put that together with the Indian reports historically, it's very compelling.
West Virginia's history goes back a long time, And where I purchased my house was actually the site of a wild man sighting where, you know, it came in and stole some animals, and then a group of guys charged off after it. They had a bunch of muskets with them and shot it, and none of the muskets wounded it, and it just took off and continued off into the forest. But, you know, that started with some form of an aggression. It seemed to be upset about something.
I've heard a lot of stories of wild men. Growing up in the 70s, I had several stories that people had told me about certain areas in West Virginia where, you know, there's this man, don't go into that area. There's this guy who comes off the hill, and he's a big hairy guy. And, you know, we're thinking, of course, at the time, we're talking about a crazy old man. Well, he might have been. But now that I look back at it, I'm thinking, well, that could have been Bigfoot. I mean, I don't know, you know. So you look back at these legends that you hear growing up, and you think about it all later on, and you kind of start to wonder, well, is that what they were talking about?
It's interesting, you know, we don't have a great number of stories about things that Bigfoot did. We have more stories about their behaviors. And that's one of the things that, you know, when we consider like common things that people talk about now, like tree structures or nests or whatever, you know, I'm not saying they exist. I think that if other primates around the world are using them, they're probably likely that they would use them here too. But why don't we have a historical record of it? Like, you don't hear the Indians talking about Bigfoot bending over trees and doing that. Certainly, if they did it all the time or commonly, the Indians would have recognized it. And they would have talked about it like they talk about other behaviors with Bigfoot, that, you know, where they are they're whistling, and they're this and they're that.
It's one thing to be entertained by a Bigfoot story in the news, but it's quite another to investigate a sighting, track down and speak with eyewitnesses, and travel to and from remote locations. As time has passed, a growing number of West Virginians are willing to put their resources and reputation on the line to examine this mystery. If the search for the Stone Man was nothing more than an excuse to enjoy the great outdoors, it would be understandable. Natural beauty beckons from every portion of the state, as close as the next bend in the road. But it's often personal experience that propels one into active investigation, whether it's the memory of a dramatic campfire tale, the discovery of a clear footprint, or a family member's face-to-face encounter with an ape-like giant. In keeping with mountain culture's values of self-reliance and respect of property and privacy, Sasquatch research was typically a solitary pursuit for most of the 20th century. When it was conducted at all, it was carried out by dedicated individuals, well known within their communities, trusted to keep a confidence. It wasn't until the mid-1990s and the gradual introduction of the internet that researchers could widely share their findings, and witnesses could submit reports with a reasonable level of anonymity. Groups like the Bigfoot Field Research Organization created a systematic way of compiling and classifying information online. But even then, when local members were dispatched to the scene to gather data, they were reminded every sighting was personal. Every sighting left a deep mental and emotional impression. Whether part of a team or working independently, researchers learned time and again that they served a therapeutic role by providing a space in which eyewitnesses could unburden themselves without fear of ridicule.
I know I took one report. There's a lot of reports that stand out to me as just being so exceptional. Just this year, because I'm thinking of just recent ones, you know, I took a report from a counselor. This gentleman's a legitimate woodsman. He digs thousands of dollars worth of ginseng, and to find that in West Virginia anymore, you have to look on maps and go to very, very deep places where no one else is going. And he was with his grandson in a location where they had to walk 4 hours to get to this place. And he told me that when he started over this hill, that was like kind of a clear-cut area, and but on the other side of the hill was old growth, large, dark, kind of a dim area. And when they started over that hill, he said that he said, I thought somebody laughed at me, is what the noise was, but I didn't see anything. And so then when he got over that hill, he could see something dark down there, around 80 yards from him, and it was shaking a tree, making noises. And so, his stepson was with him. His stepson's young, and he is scared to death. This guy's just not really sure what it is. But he sees, one of the things I thought was interesting, because, we always hear about, Bigfoot's pushing trees over, break them, or whatever happens. But this guy watched the Bigfoot do it, and he said it pulled the tree toward him. And so it kind of eventually ran up on this hill, and so they went down there, and he told his stepson, he's like, listen, I want to go down there and see where it was pulling those trees and look at it. And he went down there and looked at them, and when he did that, he heard this rock rolling over the hill, and he looked up there, and he could just see it. It was squatted down by the stump. And that went on for a few minutes, and eventually they just worked their way out. And it's so interesting to me, like, I took another report earlier this year. There was a gentleman that was driving up a mountainous road here just outside of Charleston, not maybe 5 minutes from downtown. He sees a Bigfoot. Him and his wife and his mother-in-law all see it. It's the daytime. It's standing there on the edge of this road, and it goes back over the hill. He gets out. He sees the track. He casts it. That's how I met him. I went up and met him 1 week later, cast another track, which was sent off to Cliff Barrickman and Dr. Meldrum, and they were verified that it was a legitimate Bigfoot track. But everybody gets interested in Bigfoot when they have these things happen, but they don't recognize how rare the animal is. And so they had this thing, and they think, well, I'm going to start, like the one guy said, I'm going to start this YouTube group where I'm going to go around and look at evidence and all this stuff. Well, you get into the woods and you find out that even someone that's in the woods as much as me, a couple hundred hours, over the course of, say, 2 months, I may be out that much. Seldom do you ever hear or see anything.
In 2016, it was about midnight. I was pulling into the driveway of our home. At the time, I did a lot of yard work since then, but you would have to take a sharp left turn in the vehicle. And it was a slightly uphill grade in our back. So when you would make that left turn, your headlights would sweep the entire backyard. And when I made the left turn, my headlights swept the backyard, and I saw clearly about a 6 foot to 6'3" creature that had its back turned to me. The typical, you'll hear guys say, it was built like a linebacker. This thing was built like a linebacker. It had a mane, or the way you describe a guy with real long hair. It had hair like a mane that went all the way down to its butt. When the lights hit it, it was so quick, 2 steps or 2 bounds, however you want to call it, boom, boom, up the hill, and it was gone. Had these other things not happened to me, I'd have thought I was hallucinating. I go in the house, I go straight to get a piece of paper. I'm going to draw what I just saw. And my wife goes, I don't know what's going on outside, but something has our dog spooked crazy in the backyard. So I just kind of laughed. I'm like, well, I just saw something in the backyard. Last year I was working up on the lease property, opening some roads. And if you get up on top of a ridge, especially during the winter time when everything's quiet, you fire up a chainsaw, you can hear it everywhere. And I kept getting the feeling I was being watched. The thought I had was, way down in the hollow toward the town, you have private property. And the land that we lease goes right to the center of the ridge. But the chainsaw sound was carrying. My thought was, somebody thinks I'm up here taking their timber. Then I realized I'm opening roads. So I got to a point I kept looking over my shoulder. I cut logs probably for about 2 hours. And how I ended up seeing this thing, so I was cutting left-handed. And I would look over my shoulder to my right, back to where I kept feeling like somebody was watching me, never saw anything. But I took a little break and I repositioned myself. and I was on the other side of the tree. So then I just had to do that, and when I glanced, I started calling it a shadow man, because it was a solid black, like a humanoid figure behind a tree kind of looking at me. And when I looked at it, it kind of just, and it was gone. It disappeared behind a tree. I stayed and I looked. The tree was about probably 60 yards away. From the angle I was at, I was thinking I had to be imagining things, or this thing's disappeared into thin air. So what I did later, I went and got my son, he's 5'11", 220 pounds. He's a college football player. I kind of went back to the place, and I had him go to that tree. And I wanted him to stand there the exact same way what I had saw, just to get a reference. He was so small at that tree, I realized I wouldn't even have seen him. So whatever was there was probably at least 2 feet taller and much broader in girth. And I'm assuming whatever happened, it must have dropped down to the ground, because you had a slightly downward slope toward where the trees were. And if something would have dropped to the ground, it could have just eased out of there, and I'd have never saw it from my location. That was the last eyewitness account I had. And my wife has seen, she don't like to talk about it. She says, I don't want people to think I'm crazy. I was of that opinion too in the beginning, but there comes a time when so much stuff happens, and you gotta just accept the fact that, hey, it is what it is. And there's a lot of people out there seeing these things. This past October, I sent Russ Jones some audio.
Howl twice. I'm gonna try to holler, see if it'll answer me.
Did you pick it up? And again, I'm never looking for this stuff. I'm usually up in there cutting wood or clearing roads. We had 3 different howls coming from 3 different locations, 13 times, 13 howls from 3 different locations, 3 wood knocks, 2 whistles, and a tree shoved over. This happened over about a 20-25 minute period, but things like that do happen. And it's just one of those things where you almost get accustomed to it, to where you don't even get rattled by it. If my son was here, he had a really scary encounter happen. They never saw what it was, but it was him and two of his classmates, who were the one neighbor I told you I had, who lives about 200 or 300 yards away from us. They have young sons. They were all probably 17 at the time. My son was a senior. The one boy was a senior. His younger brother was a junior. And they were coyote hunting back. There's a cemetery back in behind their house on top of the ridge. When he came back home that night, he was terrified. They're country boys. They hunt to stay in the woods. But what had happened, he said, so what we did, we were using I have fawn in distress and all that that you use over a loudspeaker. He said, we've been using that. He said, we were doing all that, but we got bored, so we decided to quietly get down out of our stand. What they were on a horse trailer. They had a horse trailer. They were on top of that trailer, using it as a high point. He said, we got down out of the trailer, and they had parked the side by side a couple hundred yards away. And he said they started walking to the side by side, and something had stalked in on them. And the way they described it, it was about 30 yards away. They didn't see it because it was 3 in the morning. They said it roared so loud, it literally like stunned them. And it scared them so bad. The one kid I guess, peed all over himself. They said whatever it was just, it was impossible a human being could have made the sound. And it was so deep and guttural that it just horrified them. They took off running. Now here they are, the AR-15, one of them I probably had AR-15, one of them's had a 30-06, whatever. They panicked, they ran, they sprinted all the way to the side-by-side, jumped on the side-by-side, took off, and he said they almost wrecked and went over the hill. Now when you go over a hill in McDowell County, you go over a hill for 5 minutes, you keep going. Would never go back in the woods. Don't know what it was. It was probably within 30 or 40 minute walk from where I had the first encounter to where this happened. But as the crow flies, 500 yards. Because you're on top of one ridge, you'd have to go all the way down the ridge, down deep into the hollow, cross over the creek, and go back up toward the other side. That'd take you 40 minutes. But if you could actually just shoot a straight line, you're only talking, a few hundred yards. So a lot of activity in that area. It's happened to several people.
It takes a certain blend of qualities to put down roots in West Virginia. A person had better have an abundance of common sense, a generous spirit, and a comfort level with solitary places. When that's combined with curiosity, open-mindedness, and determination, a person may have what it takes to pursue the Bigfoot enigma in this beautiful but often unforgiving environment. In some ways, West Virginia has steadfastly resisted the trends and fads that sweep through more metropolitan areas. Faith and family are still revered, and while there's plenty of fun to be had, people don't have much time for foolishness. Generations last here through perseverance and old-fashioned hard work, and a person's word is binding. All of which means that if you meet someone who's willing to look you in the eye and say they saw an 8-foot-tall, hairy man-beast, you'd better listen. They're not telling you this because it's trendy, or because they're seeking attention. They're telling you because it happened. Chances are they don't even want to talk about it, but they don't know what else to do. West Virginia has been overlooked in general, with the American appetite for expansion heading ever westward, and American culture conveyed by cities on both coasts. West Virginia is likewise underestimated when it comes to the reality of mystery primates, its Sasquatch accounts written off as superstition or folklore. The region has no equivalent to the Pacific Northwest Bigfoot boom of the 1950s and 60s and the attendant media coverage. Instead, the sightings here have just steadily happened, quietly acknowledged as an occasionally shocking part of life in the hills. Researchers like Russ Jones want to go beyond the legends and gather evidence of an undiscovered animal for analysis, document cases, and help witnesses to make sense of what they've seen.
You look online, it's like that much about West Virginia. And even in these magazines, I mean, the old UFO magazines, I mean, these from the 60s and 70s, there is just not a lot from this state. This, I call the Panhandle the Bermuda Triangle because nobody hardly talks. Now, we're going to make the biggest effort we ever have in trying to get and pull these reports out of here by some events and things like that.
There's only a handful of people that I know that investigate. Of course, keep in mind, West Virginia is about 6-hour drive from the Panhandle near DC over to Kentucky. we have less people than Columbus has in just the city. So we're not a very populated area. Some of our counties and the mountain areas have less people per square mile than any place in the entire eastern United States. So there's not a lot of people around, but even though there's not, we're still about number 14 with Bigfoot reports. So I think that really speaks out to how much that there is. George, I know that it's always so hard when people are talking about Bigfoot because, you know, here it's kind of a controversial thing. You know, you're a retired state trooper. You know, you are someone that's trained in stressful situations. You know, it does not affect you like it does other people. And what I'm wondering though, you know, I know that you're one of those people that when you go in the woods, you know, you're not going to think something is a bear because, I mean, obviously, you know, here we are in the middle of the woods, there's bears all around us right now. You're used to seeing them. But can you give me a description? You know, I know that you've had a couple sightings, you know, in terms of what the animal looked like to you, the color of the animal, you know, the approximate size.
Well, the first one was, it was basically near dark. So it was dark in color. I'm going to say it's probably a very dark brown to black. It was about 60 yards away. So to make out facial features, I couldn't really make out any facial features. Didn't see any eye glow or anything like that. But the shoulders were extremely broad. And I'm going to say I'm 6'3". This thing was at least 1 foot to 2 feet taller, just an estimate. Because when when you're looking at 180 to 200 feet away, things look a lot smaller. This thing was massive.
We had talked about previously, you know, sometimes because Bigfoot are a large animal, you know, they generally just can't stay in one place because, you know, they exhaust the food source. So it seems like that they're moving through a course or pattern, kind of following the food. So have you noticed that they're not in your area all the time, that, you know, there's cycles, or what are you experiencing?
Well, honestly, how I noticed that was started reading some of your books and how you take them, you kind of take a scientific approach to how you investigate stuff. And that's the same way we did in law enforcement. So I actually went back and started reading through my journal because I talked to a guy and he said, hey, you need to start keeping a journal of things. And I started to see patterns. And what really rung a bell with me was I'd contacted you, I think, probably October, November, and to send you some audio that we'd gotten, just coincidentally, we were out in the woods, trail cameras. And it seemed like for a period of that time, it was just, there was stuff happening every day. I've got a hot tub. We'd be out at night with the fire going. Hot tub, you can get in the middle of winter. We would hear stuff. To a point, you start to think, man, I'm hearing, I've got to be imagining this. There's stuff going on every night here for the last 2 or 3 weeks.
But do you think that you were hearing that stuff previously to all this and didn't think anything about it?
Guarantee it.
Okay.
Especially wood knocks.
Yeah.
Wood knocks, I don't know how many times I've been in the woods, get in a tree stand 40 minutes before daylight, settle down, you'll hear a pop. To me, that's a tree cracking. That's maybe
it could be the sap coming up in a tree. It could be something just falling. You didn't necessarily associate it with something until after you had your encounter, your first one, and then you started thinking, you know, I think it's important for you to keep track of everything that you're hearing, seeing, suspecting, even if it's not even true, so that later you can look back like you did now and notice, well, they're really not here all the time. They're here, you know, a couple times a year or whatever it happens to be. And that seems to be, you know, what we hear across the nation.
That's one of the things that I've realized. It's all the things that I thought were random, you realize there's a pattern, and then I get to reading a lot of your literature, you realize there's a pattern that everyone expresses, kind of the same thing. It's kind of, and then once there's so many coincidences, you got to realize, okay, maybe this is not a coincidence. There's a pattern to this stuff. And that's no different than when you investigate a crime. You know, you try to prove someone innocent to a point you can't prove them innocent anymore, then you got to understand, okay, this person's probably guilty. When you have a collection of evidence, eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence, once you get volumes of it, you got to say, this can't be a coincidence anymore. About a year, I started getting very curious. So I started getting as much literature as I could, reading up, probably doing what everybody does when they go through what I did. And you start to see a pattern. And then, of course, you don't realize how much time you guys put into stuff until you you start reading your stuff there.
Yeah, it's a passion for a lot of people across the country.
Yeah, no doubt.
The Appalachian Mountains define West Virginia. With the highest mean elevation east of the Mississippi, rainfall averages near 70 inches in the most forbidding areas, and some of the least populated counties in the eastern United States, West Virginia provides ideal habitat for a creature like Bigfoot to go mostly unnoticed. Russ Jones has pointed out that much reported Sasquatch activity throughout the country takes place at elevations between 1,500 and 2,000 feet, which matches almost all of the mountain state. It's exactly this type of rational analysis that grounds Jones's research, a level-headed approach that has yielded insightful results and bolstered his credibility among eyewitnesses and fellow researchers alike. That being said, there are a number of Bigfoot reports from West Virginia that contain incredible, irrational details, things that science struggles to measure or classify. Some elements of these accounts suggest that this is more than a zoological mystery. Some older, darker, more bizarre secret the peaks and hollers have guarded for countless ages.